Hey students, it's Mrs. T, and this is our first full lecture in week 4. It's the second video you're watching, but it's really the first time you're going to have a lot of stuff to take notes on. So, behind me, you're seeing something that should be familiar from having watched the first short video. This is a graphic representation of the different stages of what we call the demographic transition model. And these different stages, 1 through 5, are depicted on every single demographic transition model that you will find if you want to do a search. But not all of the demographic transition models that you find will have stage 5 thoroughly defined. Because until very recently, most geographers did not agree that stage 5 was actually happening or observable in our world. And now there are some geographers who are saying, absolutely, we are observing demographic trends that are happening today, and we can see that stage 5 of demographic transition is happening. So I just switched to another view here. This is another more detailed view of the demographic transition model that you can find if you do a search for this and look at the images. You will see any number of different depictions of this. But this I picked out because it doesn't have the population pyramids underneath it, but it has a whole bunch of descriptions about what to expect, what the behavior is that you expect in this first, second, third, all of these stages moving forward. And then you see this one gives you a little bit more information about number 5. The first one gave you none. This one gives you none, like dotted lines, because that's theoretical. That hasn't necessarily happened yet when this one was developed, so there's no population pyramid to go with it. And this one over here has some speculation, I guess, future predictions, I guess you could say. And so anyhow, it's a little bit different, the information that you get on this one, but they're both depicting what we call demographic transition. Now, when you're reading in your textbook, chapter 2 on population, you will, if you have the 11th edition of the textbook, the authors do not write about stage 5 as something that's happening yet. They write about 4 stages of demographic transition. But if you have the 12th edition of the textbook, the authors do. One of the updates that they have in the 12th edition of the textbook is that they acknowledge, or they think that they are acknowledging, that stage 5 is actually observable in demographic trends today. And like this particular chart gives you, this one, there's an example line, and it says, like in stage 2, it says Egypt and Kenya and India, then stage 3, Brazil, stage 4, USA, Japan, France, etc. And in 5, they say Germany and Italy as examples of demographic transition that is declining. So, there's a different example than that in the textbook that the textbook authors give us. So that's going to be something that we're going to look at a little bit more deeply when we complete our thorough discussion of demographic transition. But for now, we're going to look at the much simpler, visually simpler chart that you saw in that first short video with me this week. We're going to start with stage 1. Now, when you're reading about stage 1 in your textbook, whether it's the 11th edition or the 12th, you will read about agriculture and food supply. You will read about germs and food insecurity and things that were keeping the death rate high. Even though the birth rate was high, the death rate was also high, and so population stayed low and relatively stable. I, however, am going to back up from that because this stage 1, as it mentions briefly in the textbook, it says that it is for the most of human history. Stage 1 is what we were in for the majority of human history. And really, most textbooks look at the 14th century, the 1300s, when the plague was happening in England and parts of Europe. Most geographers look at that part of human history to describe stage 1, because agriculture was already the dominant subsistence strategy that world populations, for the most part, were using. But I want to back up and focus on that statement that's in our textbook that says, for the majority of human history, we were in stage 1. And I want to give you a little bit of background. You'll notice that I'm not in front of the whiteboard today, but I've got some notes on this document here that would be on the whiteboard behind me if I was doing the video that way. But I want to talk about subsistence strategies that actually led up to human beings surviving throughout the millennia until agriculture became a pattern of norms and a social system that developed to feed expanding populations. So I won't spend too much time on this, but I think it's important for you to know that there are more methods than merely agriculture to feed societies. So I want to talk about that also. Okay, so first of all, you've heard me use the word subsistence strategy. So I have it spelled out right here. I've got plural, subsistence strategies. So these are, in a nutshell, plans for survival, because to subsist means to survive from day to day. But I've got a more complicated explanation of what a subsistence strategy is. Of course, to survive from day to day, you need adequate food, you need potable water. Potable means drinkable. It's safe to drink. It won't make you sick. You need shelter. Not every place in the world do you need the same kind of shelter. You can consider clothing shelter. You can consider buildings shelter. You can consider temporary structures as shelter. Not every place, not every climate everywhere in the world requires the same kind of shelter or any at all. But shelter is sometimes necessary for daily survival, and also oxygen, of course. The human being needs oxygen, of course. So a plan to get all of that, not only for you, but for every member of society, that's what a subsistence strategy is. So early on, in human history, the goal of life was survival from day to day. So when I tell you here that the plan becomes a pattern of norms that becomes the social structure that everyone learns and passes the habits and the customs and the traditions and the skills and the knowledge, pass all of those patterns that are necessary for survival from day to day, you pass knowledge of that from older generations to younger generations so that the entire social group survives. And there are 5 different subsistence strategies that, if this was a straight anthropology class instead of a cultural geography class, we would be going into these first 3 subsistence strategies in great detail. I'm not going to spend too much time on them now because in geography, frankly, we're a little bit biased in favor of agrarian culture. We skip over this a lot, and I think I know why, but I don't like that bias being there. So I want to go back and tell you about foraging, horticulture, and pastoralism, because without those subsistence strategies over the millennia of human existence, agriculture would not, there wouldn't have been human beings to have developed agriculture in the long run anyway. So let's look at this. Okay, so foraging is the first of the 5 subsistence strategies because it's the oldest, okay? So archaeologists are aware of subsistence strategies and the transition of subsistence strategies over the millennia because human beings leave stuff behind. Human beings leave trash behind. We leave waste behind. We leave stuff behind. And archaeologists can observe what we leave behind and get a lot of information about what our culture was like. So foraging is otherwise known as hunting. I had a little glitch in my video just then. Sorry about that. But hunting and gathering is what foraging means. Okay, so this word together includes hunting and gathering. Of course, fishing is part of hunting, and gathering animals and other creatures, not just plants, is part of gathering. You can go to the Arkansas riverbanks and gather mussels, which are perfectly edible, or gather box turtles or something like that, which are perfectly edible, but they're on the endangered species now, so don't do that. Just like you can gather foxtails or any other plants that are edible in our environment. And if some of the things that I just rattled off to you, you're thinking, wow, you can eat that? Wow, I would never consider eating that. Well, it's because you and I are not exclusively foragers. Some of you might be hunters. You might go frog gigging and you might go squirrel hunting. Your freezer might be full of venison right now. However, that's not our primary way of feeding ourselves in this world that we live in today. If your primary way of feeding yourself, your immediate family, and your immediate social group was whatever you could get off the land, then you would have a great deal more knowledge that wasn't passed down through the education system, but it was passed down through the elders to you in society, so that you would spend the majority of your time focusing on food getting and food getting related activities, such as making weapons or making traps or making baskets or things to haul food with. You would spend the majority of your time during the day doing that. Now, foraging societies have a tremendous amount of knowledge about the natural environment, and in foraging there's no manipulation. Something's happening with my computer here. It keeps glitching. But anyway, so with foraging, there's no manipulation of the, I think every time I type is the problem. There's no manipulation of the natural environment to modify the naturally occurring food in the environment. Okay. So, in other words, if, I don't like this example, but I'll go ahead and use it. If, berries are what you go out and gather. People focus on gathering berries as something that a hunting gathering society would do. Okay, but berries are only ripe and only present in the natural environment for a short time, one particular season of the year. And in a foraging society, they would not gather berries to harvest the seeds, preserve the seeds, and intentionally plant those extra seeds next year in the place where the berry patch was. Instead, they only collect what the natural environment produces, and they don't over-collect what the natural environment produces because they rely on the natural environment to replenish itself as the seasons change. So, in the human environmental interaction part of Mr. Help, there is a lot of human environmental interaction, but there's not any modification of the environment to force it to unnaturally produce extra food of a certain type in order to get a population to survive. So foraging is the primary subsistence strategy that got human beings to survive for 40,000 years before there was any other type of evidence in the archaeological record that human beings had started modifying their environment in order to manipulate a food supply. Foraging cultures are what we call egalitarian. That means that people are relatively equal because they have relatively the same social value compared to each other. That doesn't mean that they are entirely equal because there were gender roles. Typically males were hunters and typically females were gatherers. But since hunting and gathering both were vitally important for the survival of the entire social group, whether you were a hunter or you were a gatherer, your job was equally important in the eyes of the social group. And therefore, there wasn't like this huge social inequality issue like you and I experience in our life, or like we can see evidence of around us in the world today. Foraging was very conservative minded. They didn't manipulate the environment. They didn't cause overtaxation to the natural world. And it was the original subsistence strategy that all of us survived by. And so for the majority of stage 1, foraging was it. So in our next video, we will finish up any amount of information about foraging that I might have forgotten to tell you this time. And we will move on to horticulture, which is about 12,000 years old in the archaeology record. So I will see you next time. Sorry for those glitches where the video started and stopped. Bye.